Hi, everyone, and welcome to TSG and Sygentia Innovation's latest webinar, FDA Regulatory Strategy and Value Proposition for Better Medical Product Development. I'm Kate Marchio, Director of Business Development, and I will be your host for today. As mentioned, the webinar is brought to you by both TSG and Sygentia, who are both part of the science group. We have an excellent panel lined up to discuss regulatory challenges for those of you who are involved in developing, marketing, or investing in medical devices. A couple quick things to point out before we begin. This is an interactive session, so you'll have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the discussion. Please submit them by typing them into the chat section of your control panel. You can submit these questions at any time, and we'll make sure to answer as many as we can. You can also use the chat pane if you have any technical issues, and we'll do our best to resolve those for you. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our panelists today. Each brings a key perspective to the table from regulatory, product development, and strategic value proposition. We're very excited to have Laurie Clarke join us as Vice President and Principal of Medical Device Regulatory at TSG. Laurie heads our FDA device practice. Laurie was an FDA partner at 3 top-tier law firms, focused on medical device regulation, and throughout her career, including more than 25 years practicing FDA law, Laurie has helped a number of companies obtain FDA clearance with a wide variety of devices. Hi, Laurie.
Hi, Kate. Thank you.
Secondly, we have Rob Morgan. Rob is Managing Partner for Sygentia Innovation's medical business. He's worked in the medtech industry for over 20 years, including 13 years in the orthopedic industry with Smith & Nephew. He brings a diverse experience of developing medical devices, from anything from robotic surgery systems to in vitro diagnostics, all the way from early concept creation to full product launch. Hi, Rob.
Hey, Kate.
Thank you for joining today. And thirdly, we have Eduardo von Ristow. Eduardo joined Sygentia Innovation at the beginning of the year as a medical advisory partner. Throughout his career in new technology and product development, he brings a key lens, helping clients develop the right value proposition for their business among tightly regulated industries. Hi, Eduardo. Welcome.
Hi, Kate. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So why don't we kick off the discussion today, perhaps with a few questions to set the foundation. Laurie, can you please share a little bit about what we mean by regulatory strategy?
Sure. Basically, regulatory strategy is a fancy name for your regulatory plan. What steps you're going to take to achieve your ultimate regulatory objective. And that objective can be obtaining FDA authorization to market your device, or it can be a whole host of other regulatory issues. But we're going to focus on the obtaining FDA authorization to market your device, because that is the discussion that Rob, Eduardo, and I mostly have around regulatory. And it's a process that involves roughly 6 major steps. 1, doing the research to determine how FDA is going to regulate your product. 2, and this is an optional step depending on how well known the technology is and how established the regulatory path is. But if it isn't well known and well established, you might want to go to FDA and get FDA's feedback. And in order to do so, you prepare a pre-market submission. To get that feedback from FDA, you actually have to submit a written document that has questions for FDA and has information about the product and the testing that you've done. Then you meet with FDA in the 3rd phase of it. And prior to the meeting, FDA gives you written feedback, and then you ask follow-up questions, or if there's something unclear, try to work through the pathway there. Then the 4th stage is obtaining the data you need for the the market submission. The 5th stage is actually preparing the pre-market submission that includes the data. And the 6th stage is after you've submitted it and during the review process when FDA requests additional information, responding to it. And then that gets you hopefully to your clearance or approval, and then there's follow-up stages. But that's your objective for that first strategy.
And what are some of the benefits of having a solid strategy versus the risks of perhaps not having one?
Sure. There are many benefits of having a regulatory strategy, and one of which is it helps put you in the driver's seat. By having a regulatory strategy, you go to FDA and tell them what you're planning to do and get FDA's reaction to it, rather than having FDA create your own regulatory path. For example, you go to FDA and say, we're going to submit a 510K for this device using Y devices are predicate. We're proposing to do X, Y, and Z bench testing. We're going to do an animal study. We don't believe clinical data is necessary. And then you ask FDA a series of questions. And FDA answers the specific questions you ask. And you phrase your questions to hopefully get the answers you want from FDA, but to at least get a very concrete answer to it. You don't ask a question such as, is this going to lead to you clearing my product? But do you agree that the proposed testing in 5 animals under these conditions will lead the type of safety and effectiveness data that you can use to evaluate this feature of the device? And then, yes, no, and some follow-up information from FDA. The other side of that coin is the disadvantages of not doing it, is that you're allowing FDA to drive your regulatory program. And by nature, their job is to minimize the risk to the agency, to the public health. They're going to go for the most conservative route, whether that means a higher regulatory path or more data. FDA loves data, and the more data they can get to look at, the less it is risky for them, but it's more time consuming and cost effective for the company. Another benefit to it is that it has an orderly process, so you can mark your progress. You know when things should be done. If something slips, you know how to adjust for it. And no matter how good you are at designing a regulatory strategy, something comes up, it changes some point in the process. A competitor's product gets cleared, something isn't working quite right, you want to change your claim. Having a strategy allows you to go back and say, what do I need to do to modify my strategy, instead of just kind of responding to the immediate situation. And so it helps keep you on path. And the negative sides of these are that when companies don't have one and they respond to everything in the press, like one day FDA says, the press says, this is an important feature, or this is the type of claim that this is important for patients to have this, and you say, well, that's not the claim I was going for, but I'm going to change it to address that. You take in information, and when necessary, you adjust it, but having a plan means you just don't react to things. You are in control. So you don't react to FDA, and you don't react to what's out there in the press unless it makes sense to do so. But it gives you the flexibility to do so when it makes sense to do so.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely makes a lot of sense. Eduardo, can you please share a little bit about what we mean by value proposition in terms of this context?
Yeah, so Laurie said about being in the driver's seat. The value proposition is the driver's seat. So it's about having 3 pillars really well understood. So first one is understanding your stakeholders, understanding your users, your patients, what are their drivers, what are the requirements, what actually do they need from your product and from you. The second one is commercial viability. Commercial viability, regulatory freedom to operate or regulatory approval is part of commercial viability, because without regulatory approval, you cannot sell your product. So, but it's about understanding the market, understanding what are the spaces, what are your competitors, what's out there, what's emerging. The third one is technical viability. So it's about making sure that the technology can address the unmet need that you're proposing, can match the claims. So it's really important to have claims that fulfill the regulatory requirements, and also the commercial requirements for your product, because you don't want to have a weak claim that might hurt your marketing effort. You don't want to have a extremely bold claim that will drive your regulatory requirements up without necessity. So it's about having those three pillars really well constructed. So, and being in that driver's seat and being proactive and not reactive. And that's really important, because it's about having the power to understand when the market changes, if it changes, or if regulation changes, what do you have to do and why do you have to do certain things, and if you have to do them as well.
Excellent. Sounds like an important piece that can make or break a company, really. Rob, can you share a little bit about the major stages in development of a device, and at what stage the R&D team typically reaches out to the FDA or the regulatory team?
Sure. So Eddie's described the really exciting bit of the R&D and innovation process of getting that value proposition right, defining the concept for the new product. And once that concept is sufficiently well defined, then formal product development starts. And from a quality management perspective, that's when design controls are applied. And that's, from a company perspective, it's also when large investment into the project starts and continues from that point onwards. So you're typically defining all of the design inputs at that start point. That's the start of the design controls process. And from that point onwards, you've got a train running down the track in a certain direction. And the key to successful product development, or a key to successful product development, is doing all of those things that Eddie and Laurie have talked about setting the right value proposition and getting the regulatory strategy in place beforehand. Because then you're into a product development process that you don't really want to change all that much. So you asked about the stages, Kate. So I talked about establishing design inputs at the start. Then you're into detailed design, iterating around different prototypes, gradually getting towards the product, which is representative of the final commercial product that you're going to have, so that you can then do verification and validation on that, transfer into volume manufacture, and it's at that stage that you're going to be making your filing to FDA. Now, you also asked about the point at which the R&D team want to be interacting with FDA. I'd look to Laurie actually to guide us on that, and I would be reaching out to a regulatory professional to tell me what's the right time to interact with FDA through that product development process.
Thanks, Rob. I think there's two parts to that question. The first part is, when do you interact with your regulatory professional, and when do you interact with FDA? Because there are two parts of the getting the right regulatory inputs. And with your regulatory professional, early and often is better. We can adjust to changes to the concept, changes to the device, but we can help frame early on what is going to happen if you go down a certain path. For example, this may lead to a PMA with a 3-year clinical study. If you don't have this feature in your first device, it may take it to a de novo path, or you don't make this claim. And it's up to the company to decide which way they want to go, but it gives them the option early before these inputs are set. In terms of when to go to FDA, there's a tension, and it's a friendly tension, and that's why it's important for all of us to have input. The value proposition, the development, the regulatory, is because the development, and I've learned since I've joined TSG and working with Rob and his team, it's important to have that information early on. But from a regulatory perspective, you don't want to go to FDA too early, because you don't want to, for several reasons, but one of the reasons is you don't want to tell FDA it's going to be X and then have to go back and tell them, well, it's actually going to have a different feature or a different claim, because FDA always remembers what you told them the first time, and they seem to forget when you tell them that this has changed. And so they'll always ask you, well, what happened to this? And it will be a constant theme. Also, if you don't have your path set, both in terms of the regulatory path and some basic testing to establish the preliminary evidence of the safety and effectiveness of the device, if it's a novel device, FDA is going to be more nervous. And nervous on FDA leads to more data and possibly a more rigorous path. So it's finding the right balance, and it's, kind of a weak analogy, but the kind of the mama bear, papa bear, and baby bear, and Goldilocks with the three chairs. It's like you want to find the right moment that you have the right fit. You don't want to go too late, because then it's whatever feedback you have from FDA, it's too hard to adjust. And you don't want to go too early, because you're not going to get as concrete a feedback from FDA. You're going to likely be more conservative. And if things change with the process, it's harder to backtrack. But that right spot is there. But then in the combination of what you get back from FDA and what your regulatory professionals are telling you should give the R&D and the value proposition the information they need to keep proceeding along the path.
Yeah, certainly the right timing is key. And obviously, too early, like you said, could be an issue. But can you talk a little bit about some of the, I guess, how people can save time and cost by going early enough to where, it's not too early, but going early enough in product development to kind of set the stage with the FDA?
Sure, I can give you a couple examples. When companies have a product, they often, the companies are proud, we're proud of the product, and you tend to think of it as being more novel than sometimes it is. Sometimes it truly is novel, but they say, oh, it will have to go this route because there's nothing like it. But in FDA's mind, it's similar enough that it could go a 510K route. So getting that feedback early will save trying to go a PMA route, which is, it's not a big 510K. A PMA is a much different regulatory challenge type of submission. It can be 35 volumes as opposed to, one volume to FDA. Also, sometimes a company thinks they're going to need to do more data. The last device in that category did X, Y, and Z. And you go to FDA and FDA says, you know what, we're comfortable enough with the basic technology that you don't have to do this. And when you walk out of a client meeting, an FDA meeting with a client, and FDA has just told them something, device testing has come off the table from a regulatory perspective, and maybe my other colleagues will jump in and have a different perspective on that, that saves them time and money. And also, to use Eduardo's phrase, de-risks the process somewhat. So you not have to worry that that test for some fluky reason may not come out right. And it gives you a level of assurance. And it's a theme that we all three of us talk about, is confidence and assurance, and knowing what you're doing and how it's going to progress is key to success in this area. And so anything you can de-risk and get that early on in the process saves you, because it's much easier to make a change before you've set your product inputs. And when we're talking about, okay, this is going to be the regulatory strategy, then after it's set, and certainly a lot easier than you have a finished product and you're about to go to market, or you think you're getting the authorization, and FDA says, wait a minute, you want to do this differently. That is a really hard hurdle to overcome.
And Rob, maybe a good question for you. how well defined does a product concept need to be before you can start defining that regulatory strategy?
Clearly, you've got to have done enough. Now, you don't want to leave it too late, do you? I mean, you certainly don't want to be in a situation where you've set all your design inputs for your product development, and then you change regulatory strategy, or you change course to the extent that those requirements change significantly. The standards that you're having to develop your product to have to change significantly. So that's the thing you want to avoid. So you need to know enough about the product. And I would say that's about defining the technology that's within the product, because that may change your regulatory approach. It's about defining the functions and attributes of the product, because that may change how it's regulated. The indications for the product, for sure. So you need to define that product concept enough, but it does need to occur before you start formal product development, for sure.
And in terms of the input, Laurie, can you talk a little bit about, what are some of those inputs to a technology or a product roadmap?
Well, you've touched on two of them. The first two questions I get when somebody calls me, either a client or from R&D or a value proposition, is what regulatory path is it going to go down? What type of pre-market submission, if any, is it going to require? Basically what the regulatory path means. And what data? And my benefit to them is to give them, based on my experience, based on the research we do, based on my knowledge of how FDA tends to look at these products, what I think those are going to be. Sometimes you can tell them pretty definitively. A spinal disc, there's a classification regulation and it says it's a class 3 device, and there's a guidance document and it tells you this. Other times it's more, here's my preliminary assessment, and if we want more certainty, how we approach FDA to get that certainty.
And
But I'd be
Rob
curious
and Eduardo, yeah, I'm curious what your perspectives on that is.
Well, you talked about approaching FDA, Laurie. So I guess for me, the timing there is whether you're doing that with data and data on the product. So if you're having to provide data on the product, it's got to be sufficiently representative of the final product, I guess. And so you've got to go some way down the product development path to have got that data. But do you necessarily need to have that, Laurie, in order to have your first discussion with FDA?
Good question, Rob. It partly depends on what your question you're asking FDA. If it's a truly novel device and it's something that FDA is going to be concerned about and wary about, having some data often makes them more comfortable. And so they may be more receptive to a different path. But the regulatory path per se isn't decided. That can change. So if the decision is the R&D team needs input earlier and we go to FDA and they tell us we don't have much data, and they say, well, we're not going to make a decision, but we think it may be going to PMA versus de novo, we can, and again, I'm saying this from a regulatory perspective, have it a strategy that's pushing it to the de novo, but trying to keep it out of the way, PMA, but realizing that's a risk. But we've gotten the information you need on what testing needs to be done, if that's the most critical part. So it may make more sense in that situation to move it earlier. If you're asking FDA, we're proposing to do a clinical study, and these are our endpoints, and we're going to have this number of patients, and we think these are the risks, the safety risks, and we're going to look at these. Having some data to go into FDA to talk to them about what your proposed study is going to help the process along. Because, for example, if you've done a pilot study and you're going to talk to them about doing a pivotal study, you said, we did it in 15 patients and we found this issue and we made this modification to the device, or we decided we're going to limit our patient population to adults over the age of 21 to 65, or we're going to eliminate in the study people who have this underlying condition in there. The fact that you have some data and you can talk to why you're doing it and point to, and it's not just theoretical, will help move that discussion along. But it is a total continuum, and I'm much more sensitive to that continuum, having worked more directly with you and your team on this, the value of having that discussion earlier. Because I think from my regulatory perspective, my inclination is kind of pushing it not too far, but more toward the middle. And from yours perspective, I understand why it's important to have it earlier. And I think it's a matter of discussing, okay, what is most important and how do we do it? And then there's also the possibility of having two discussions. But FDA has limited resources and you don't want to go back to them too many times. And they're willing to have two discussions if it's a novel device. If it's sort of a little different from something else and you're going the 510K route, you may just irritate FDA more because it takes a lot of time for them to plan for a meeting. You know, the prep time for a 1 hour meeting is significantly longer than that 1 hour meeting. Again, and that's where we all talk, the client, the R&D, the value proposition, and figure out sort of what's the happy medium. And it's not going to be one size fits all for every product.
In terms of, I guess, obviously time to market is key. How can someone tell if an expedited pathway is open to their product?
Sure. There are two main expedited pathways. The breakthrough technology, which is for devices which the name suggests are novel. There's something that they're doing that's a major improvement in the effectiveness, either because there's nothing available or truly because they are much more effective than what is available. The safer technology pathway is intended to be for less serious diseases than the breakthrough pathway, and it focuses on products being safer, not necessarily more effective than the products out there. And there's a hierarchy between them. The breakthrough technology takes higher precedence. So while both of them get interactive review from FDA and hopefully a quicker pathway, when there's resources are limited, FDA will focus on the breakthrough first. But to answer your first question about how do you determine it, there's criteria. And FDA strictly applies those criteria. So you have to make sure you address every aspect of it and that you make your strongest argument in a request to FDA. And realizing that many companies don't get a yes on the first time around, that it may take several times and getting more data in the process, because as we talked about, FDA is a data-driven agency, and there is a value to being designated breakthrough or safer technology anywhere up till approval. But the earlier you can get it, the more beneficial it is because you're getting more interaction when many of the big decisions are being made.
I'd love to also hear, Eduardo and Rob, your perspective on how significant is an expedited pathway when it comes to product development and advisory?
Yeah, the impact is quite significant. If you think about it, a expedited regulatory pathway can reduce your time to market quite substantially. And from an investment point of view and from a commercial risk point of view, that's something that you will not want to miss. Another point is that what Laurie mentioned about having constant interactions with the FDA. So if you think about from an investor's point of view, one of the key risks is regulatory approval. If you don't have regulatory approval, you don't have a market because you won't be able to sell. But if you're in the loop with the FDA, you can work with the FDA a lot quicker into iron out any outstanding issues, and you can have a smoother regulatory pathway. So that adds a lot of value to your value proposition. That adds a lot of support to it as well. So I'd love to hear from Rob, actually, from a product development point of view. What's the impact of a expedited pathway as well?
Yeah, it probably has most impact at the back end of the project, right? So once you've done the development and you're going through the industrialization of the product in parallel with your regulatory filings, for example, if you're going to go through a quicker review process, a quicker regulatory clearance process, then everything else has got to speed up in parallel with that. So I think that's the major impact. And if you're changing time to market, like Eddie's saying, the big impact is on the commercial case for the product and the business case and the return on investment. So I think it's really interesting to be able to establish which product concepts have an expedited pathway open to them, and that becomes part of that creative iterative process as you're working through the different things that you can do as you go through our value proposition process.
Excellent. And Laurie, just kind of on the theme of getting products to market most efficiently, can you talk a little bit about how the use of the device affects this and what claims you can make?
Sure. The same product can be regulated, could be a 510K exempt device, it could be a 510K device, it could be a PMA device based on the claims you make for the product. Sometimes this exact same device, sometimes with just minor technological differences. For example, a thermocouple that's used intraoperatively to make sure that you're getting the tissue to the temperature it needs to ablate the tissue, that is going to be a PMA device most likely, and especially if the device itself is a PMA device. So you can sometimes separate the parent and the accessory. But basically the same technology, if it's used to test your forehead before you go in the store to see if you have a fever, it may not even be regulated as a device. It may be regulated as a 510K exempt device. It may put it into the 510K category. It's what you claim is going to determine, for the most part, how FDA looks at it. And that's where we add a lot of value to it, is by sitting down, literally or figuratively, with the company and the whole team, the value proposition and the product development, and say, what is necessary and how is that going to impact your regulatory strategy? And if it's going to, or in a regulatory path, if it's going to increase the amount of regulation that you're subject to, requiring a higher level of pre-market submission, requiring more data, is it worth it? Or is there a lesser claim that we can make that will satisfy your marketing objectives, that product development can meet, that will get you to market quicker, either by itself or as a first step toward the product that you ultimately want to market? And would doing the first step shorten your total time frame to get the second product? Or would it be enough of a benefit from the first step that a little delay in your second step is worth it? But claims are critical. A product that you wouldn't think of as being a medical device could become a medical device just by what you claim.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting point, because it can have products that are actually consumer health / well-being, but they use the same technology. For instance, why you know, a smartwatch that measures a heart rate normally is not a medical device, with few exceptions, and the ECG is a medical device. Obviously, different technologies there, but they're working in the same space. So what are the claims they're making? Obviously, the ECG is making a medical claim, and the smartwatch is making a consumer health or well-being claim, or just sports claim.
And sometimes the difference between them are very fine. For example, weights, like you lift, if they're marketed for use for exercising or by a person who doesn't have a health condition, they're a consumer product. But if you market them as a treatment for obesity, they become a medical device, because obesity is a medical condition. And so, you spend time with a client saying, okay, is it critical that you mention it, obesity, or is there some claim like helps in a healthy lifestyle that could include, weight loss? Is that sufficient?
Yeah, and that obviously also impacts the, eligibility for reimbursement. I see a lot of consumer products wanting to enter the medical space for that reason, and also, like you mentioned, with the claims. So yeah, I think, Eduardo, that's a great point. It really goes back to what is that value proposition, and how are you positioning yourself in the market? When it comes to a medical device containing software, Eduardo, maybe you can share a little bit about that safety classification, and what level of concern is there from the FDA regarding this?
Right. Yeah. So it all starts with risk. So you need to have a risk analysis to understand what's the risk that your software represents. Can it cause any type of injury? Can it cause death? Can it cause harm to the user? Right, we need to think about patient, but also the user, the nurses and the doctors. They're going to be interactive with your product. So if it cannot cause any harm, it will be a Class A under the IC 62304. If it can cause known serious harm, which obviously excludes death, it will be a Class B. If it can cause serious harm or death, it will be a Class C. There's an interesting example here. So let's think about a digital thermometer. So if you're having a digital thermometer in an ICU use setting, where obviously everything, every single second is really precious, and every decision is being made under a lot of stress most often, and you have that thermometer giving you a wrong reading because the software, the sensor is not calibrated, or the software has a variable that's gone rogue, it will probably lead the nurse to give the wrong medication, and that could cause the patient to die. If you change the use setting and you say, right, it's not an ICU anymore, it's actually within the hospital, but a lot, within the hospital room, a lot less critical, and it gives a wrong reading, the nurse probably will say, right, this reading looks off. Let me just check with another thermometer. Let me just check with the back of my hand. In that case, it would be a Class B. If it is at home and you're, just checking your temperature, and you can say, you know what, this is actually quite bad. This reading doesn't make any sense. Then you ring your doctor, and your doctor say, you're right, you know what, get a new thermometer, or don't take a drug, or don't take anything, and that doesn't cause any injuries or whatsoever, any harm, then it's a Class A. So it's about thinking, not only checking the boxes on the standards, it's about thinking about where will your device be used, under what situation, by whom, and on whom as well. So it's about understanding use setting, users, and patients. And then you can understand what's the risk of your software and where does it fall within the IC 62304. So I'll pass the word to Laurie, because there's a few differences regarding the FDA and the IC 62304 that are interesting to be highlighted.
FDA has a software guidance for software and contained in products for the pre-submission review, the pre-market review. And it defines 3 levels that roughly correspond with the IEC levels, but they're called, instead of A, B, and C, it's minor, moderate, and major. And in the infinite wisdom of whoever named these levels of risk, a major level of concern presents a moderate level of risk. A moderate level of concern presents a minor level of risk, and a minor level of concern presents no or negligible risk. Why they didn't match the names and the risk levels up is because they used to. But there's implications on which of those categories it falls into. And in the guidance document, FDA identifies the documentation that's required for each of those levels, the minor, moderate, and major. And the jump between minor and moderate and the type of documentation you need to include in this pre-market submission is significant. The jump between the moderate to the major, while it does require more documentation in the major, it's not as great a difference as between minor and moderate. However, FDA rarely considers a device to present a minor level of concern. Many companies have tried in their pre-market submission, and FDA often comes back to them and says major. So my advice always is to clients, if you think you're going to go minor and you're insisting on doing minor, have the documentation ready for major in case FDA comes back to you and requests it, and don't let that being a delaying factor. But it is, as Eduardo said, it's all based on what risk the software presents if it doesn't function as intended.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, that definitely can really impact your timeline if you don't get it right. When it comes to submitting a 510K, if I think my product is a class 1 or 2, what do I do if I can't identify a suitable predicate device?
Sure, there's several options. First, making sure that you have explored all the options for identifying a predicate, looking at the classification regulations, looking at the product codes, because you can tie them to specific products, doing a word search in FDA's 510K database, even looking at exempt listed devices, because you can use exempt devices as predicates. Searching for guidance documents to see if they provide examples that you could possibly use as predicate devices. But there's a point when you say, I'm not finding it, and I think it should be a class 1 device. And then there's 2 parts of that then. First part is and this sounds self-serving, but I really do mean it, is I suggest you talk to a regulatory professional who works across a broad range of devices for a number of reasons. Some of the products have classification or product code names that you wouldn't necessarily find by searching for them. One example is drug dose calculators, which you put in the values, the patient's height, their weight, their age, and various other factors, and it calculates what dose you should give them. But if you search for it, it's under the classification regulation for predictive pulmonary value calculators. And you read the classification regulation, it doesn't mention anything about drug dosage. It mentions about the pulmonary functions. So you wouldn't find that necessarily unless you stumbled on it. But somebody who's done a lot in this area and who's worked in other drug dose calculators would know how to find it. So they may be able to identify a classification or regulation or a specific product that way. Also, having a wealth of experience over a number of years, you've worked on a lot of products. And predicates, while FDA always likes newer predicates better, a predicate can be used even if it's an older device. And having looked at numerous devices and worked on submissions, products stick in your mind. And there may be something that isn't a readily identifiable predicate. It's not exactly the same technology or even very similar or indications, but it has some of the same attributes, and that could be used as a predicate device. And those are things you're not likely to find by searching any of the databases or even doing a Google search. It's just that in the middle of the night, it comes back to me as something I worked on 20 years ago and how you could do it. And then the third part of that is creativity. And not that we have monopoly on creativity, but that's our trademark, is we can put together a creative substantial equivalence argument. And I can give you an example. I worked on the first device for growing hair in men who were balding. And before I got involved in the product, the company went to FDA, and FDA indicated they thought it was going to be de novo pathway because it was the first device, there was nothing like it. And it was going to require clinical data. So while the clinical study was going on, we tried to think if we could come up with a way to push it into the 510K category. And this was especially because at that time, the de novo was a much longer route than 510K. And so what we came up with was a host of predicate devices. This used laser energy that was delivered to the scalp through what looked like a brush to stimulate the hair follicles to grow hair. So we used laser devices that removed hair to show that you could use a laser to actually affect the growth of the hair. We used lice combs that delivered energy through a brush to the hair to kill the lice, to show that you could part the hair, you could direct the energy to the right spot. And then we used a 1898, and yes, 1898, device that had been marketed before FDA began regulating devices in 1976 that claimed it could grow hair, to show that there had been marketed devices that used energy to grow hair. And FDA, through the combination of these products, allowed the product to stay in the 510K realm. But it was the clinical data that made the decision that it was substantially equivalent and to market it. But it significantly shortened the client's path to market.
Wow, that's fascinating. And does the FDA ever suggest or assign a predicate, or is that the manufacturer's responsibility?
Yes, it is the manufacturer's responsibility, but FDA has suggested predicate devices, and when they do, listen, and if there's any possibility of doing it, go for it, because FDA is giving you two messages when they tell you a predicate device. They're telling you, especially if you're thinking it's going to have to go de novo because there's no predicate, they're saying, we don't want it to go de novo, and here's a way to keep it in the 510K realm and use that. And that's when you put on your creative hat and come up with an argument, even if it isn't readily apparent using that predicate device. It also means that FDA sees some similarities between your device and there. And so you need to think hard of how to use that to your advantage. And to keep it in the 510K realm is a big advantage.
Absolutely.
Just to build on that, the FDA doesn't take unnecessary risks. So if they are giving you a predicate, there is something there that you can explore. And from a value proposition or commercial strategy point of view, that's definitely worth investigating and making sure that's the right way to do.
And FDA is very careful how they say it. You know, they're saying, did you think about this possible device? And so you have to pick up the clues that you're getting.
Wink, wink. Yeah.
Yes.
Eduardo, I'm curious just on that theme of, creating the right strategy to get to market. Does it ever make sense to create an MVP, a minimum viable product, for the first launch? Can you talk a little bit about companies employ that kind of a strategy?
Yeah, it does. Not only for the first launch as well. I think there's room to create an MVP, and I know that that's going to make Laurie smile because I learned from her. There's room to create an MVP that you don't intend to commercialize to become your regulatory predicate for a 510K. But it's about defining that MVP. It's about getting what is the minimum viable product, what are the minimal requirements, and that comes from understanding the users, the use settings, is understanding the technology as well, what are the limitations of the technology and constraints, and understanding the risks. I would love to get Rob's input on that question as well.
Well, clearly it has a big impact on the product development. if you're really intending to launch 2 products, an MVP and then a second generation product with improved performance or different features, you've really got to think about not repeating development steps, and probably think about it as a platform, and a platform that allows you to launch a first product as an MVP without then having to redo a lot of the work when you go to your second generation product. And clearly that's linked to the regulatory approach that you would take as well, right, Laurie?
Yes. And in some cases, the product is never going to be marketed. So it's a phantom product. So you can proceed directly to your second stage product that you're going to do. And because when it's a lower level product, we're not going to FDA, we don't have to have the preliminary data. It may even require much data in there. And in some cases, it's if you do have to do testing, if it's a software device, you can gray out the feature and not turn it on when you do the testing and get the data that's necessary to market or to get authorization from the first device. So as you said, it's not repeating the testing on the development side, and it's taking the benefit of not having to do it in the second stage on the 510K side.
Yeah, the MVP only makes sense if it is a step in the right direction. Normally it is, but the risk is that people focus a lot sometimes on the minimum part of the MVP, and they end up falling short of what actually is the minimum required product from a commercial viability, and even sometimes from a regulatory perspective as well.
And some companies decide, no, we don't want to take that incremental regulatory approach because it diverts our focus from the main product, and that's what we have investors interested in. We want to go to market, and sometimes it's worth it, even if it's going to take a longer and it's a PMA route versus a 510K route, to put all your focus on that product, which is going to be novel and capture a market and satisfy patient demands, rather than spending time and money developing 2 generations before that to try to shoehorn it into a different regulatory path. And that's where we all come in. Is like, okay, how do these various benefits and risks weigh up against each other? And what is ultimately going to be the most benefit to the client with their stated objective? Because oftentimes the objective changes over the course of time. If you find the regulatory path is going to be different, and hopefully early enough in this process, then they can decide whether it's worth it or not worth it to them to proceed with that first claim.
And you touch on one point that's really interesting, is the other side of the coin for a higher level regulatory pathway, which is using a higher level regulatory pathway as a protection for your market share as well. But you could have a PMA, which is a lot harder to get than a 510K, acting as a barrier to new competitors to your product.
Yes, and we always joke that every client complains when they hear it's going to be a PMA, but if once they've gotten their PMA, they certainly don't want the product down classified, because then other people can use it as a predicate. So it has a market value of having a PMA that is significantly greater than a 510K or de novo, because once you go de novo, you can become eligible to be a predicate for other devices too. So the innovator in those categories, and innovation is a little tricky word because you're supposed to be substantially equivalent to other products, but the first one often has a higher burden, has to do more testing, and then other companies piggyback onto it.
So having a PMA is almost like having a regulatory IP.
And it's often considered that. And to your value proposition, it also can go in the other way, that you can end up with clearance or even approval for a product that isn't marketable. In the end, if it's not, the value proposition isn't a big factor in the regulatory decision, or if FDA tries forcing you into that area, and whether you decide whether you continue down that path or don't. And the classic examples of that are chemotherapy products, in that by the time because many of them have like novel delivery systems or something. So it's a drug and device combination, but because it's the novel part of is the device delivery, it's often regulated as a combination product by the device center. But by the time the product gets approved, the chemotherapy agent is no longer the standard of care for that cancer. And so you're constantly struggling with off-label use for your product that you've put a lot of effort into. You're at regulatory risk of marketing it for something that it isn't cleared or approved for, and risking enforcement action, and you don't want to be there. Another example is a product that we got involved after the clinical study, late stage in the development of the device, and through no fault of the company, 2 little flukes in the measurement of data in the clinical study meant the device missed its primary endpoint by a smidgen. And FDA was very accommodating in this place. They really tried to help it, but it was designed to take the place of a significant device for detecting a serious condition, breast cancer. And so with a device, you couldn't go forward from a regulatory perspective on a device that was going to replace mammography. It was intended ultimately to replace mammography with what was in essence a failed study, even though it really did show the product was effective. So FDA came up with a lesser indication that there just was never a market for the device. And so it got de novo review, but it was a de novo that didn't allow it to really market the product.
Interesting. So I've got one more question before we get to some of the audience questions. Laurie, can you talk a little bit about when a medical device is regulated as a combination product?
Did I prompt that question? Yes. FDA defines a combination product as 2 or more of the following: drug, biologic, device. So a drug device, a drug biologic, a device biologic, a device drug, or the 3 of them would be a combination product. So then it comes down to the next level of what is a drug, what's a device, what's a biologic. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act defines those terms. And so, for example, a device, the difference between a device, and a drug is that a device achieves its purpose through physical or mechanical action, which isn't exactly spelled out in the definition, but it's the absence of what's in the drug regulation, which says it achieves its purposes by chemical or metabolic action. So once you've determined that it's a combination product because it has the drugs, the device, and the biologics in it, then it's subject to a different set of regulations. Not that there's combination product regulations, but how the components of this product are regulated. And stepping back for 1 second, a combination product doesn't have to be that you put all things in a pot and mix them together and come up with a product that, they're equally blended. It can be products that are labeled for use together, that are packaged together, that are actually physically combined. And, a classic combination product is a pre-filled syringe that's pre-filled with a drug. So it's a drug device combination. There's products that are a test kit and the product that treats the condition the test is done, that you shrink wrap together, is a combination product. And then there's products that you use 2 of them to achieve a more beneficial effect. What isn't a combination product is often as important as what is a combination product. So 2 devices are not a combination product. They're a device combination, and so they would be treated as a device. If it combines a drug device or biologic with other regulated products, such as foods or cosmetics, it's not a combination product. And if it's a regulated product of a drug device or biologic, or in a non-regulated product, for example, a smartphone. It doesn't make the smartphone a device. The app that has a device function would be a device, but it's not a combination product.
Mm-hmm. There's an interesting one there that just popped into my mind. So when Apple released the latest version of the Apple Watch, they put an ECG on it.
Mm-hmm.
And the ECG function is a medical device, but the Apple Watch is not a medical device in itself.
Mm-hmm. And it's taken FDA, a long time, and it's been an evolutionary process to get comfortable with the technology has changed greatly in the last few years. And when I started, we weren't talking Apple Watches with apps on them. There was an ECG device, and so it was very clear that that was a device. But how you treat the platform, which can affect the function of the device, but part of it is having more confidence that the manufacturer will follow the design controls, will do the testing, and that they will make sure that their app functions well on whatever platform it's using. FDA has become more comfortable with that over time.
Excellent. So we're going to go to some of our audience questions now. Thank you everyone for submitting your questions. There's still time if you have more questions to submit. The first one here, Rob, I think this is a good one for you. What should I consider when determining whether to seek a CLIA waiver for my point of care diagnostic product?
That's an important question. It does define the requirements for the device quite considerably, because it determines how much effort you have to put into designing the device to make sure that the output of the test is minimally impacted by the way in which the test is used by the user. So it comes down to whether it's actually necessary for how you want the test to be used. So if you want the test to be used at a point of care, so outside of a clear laboratory and outside of the supervision of a clear laboratory, then you do need to obtain a clear waiver for your point of care diagnostic. And if you do that, you have to put a lot of effort into developing the user interfaces for that product, the sample preparation for the product, how the tests are, test results are interpreted from the product, so that it's suitable for people in that use case to use the product with minimal risk of it leading to an erroneous result and the wrong treatment as a result of that usage.
It's an interesting point there to add as well, because if you don't, depending on the product, if you don't get a clear waiver, your commercial proposition goes literally down the drain. If it is a home setting, point of care diagnostics test, and you don't get a clear waiver, there's no point, to do that as a product. So it is paramount from a value proposition, from a commercial viability to a lot of products as well.
A follow-on question there. I have an IVD product with inboard reagents. How much real-time stability data is needed before launching a product? Maybe Laurie, do you have any ideas there?
Sure. Well, let's step back and talk generally. First of all, like the big principles on stability data is you have to have data to support what you claim. So if you're claiming it has a year shelf life, you have to have data to support a year shelf life. And that can be real-time data that the product sits aside for a year, and then you test it and show that the function hasn't degraded or hasn't degraded more than a certain percent or amount in that year. Or you use accelerated testing. In most cases, if you do accelerated testing in your submission, FDA requires you to follow up with the real-time data. many times it doesn't have to be submitted to FDA. You have to document it in your files. So for example, and I'm just picking some numbers out of there, if 6 months worth of accelerated data is the equivalent of a year data in that situation, then you file with 6 months of accelerated data, you claim a 1-year shelf life, and you continue your non-accelerated testing till you have 1-year data, and you put it in your regulatory files, assuming your product's been cleared before then. As a general rule, FDA wants to see at least 6 months of shelf life testing, because they don't want you to have product that goes out to market and is immediately, obsolete. It makes for irritated customers. It makes for additional expense. It runs the risk of tests being done with products that are no longer stable and may give different results. And in terms of something that's part of the system itself, you need to consider both the actual duration of life of the reagents and what you're claiming for this system. Because if, for example, if it's something that's a disposable and you're claiming that the product can sit on the shelf for 3 years and your reagents are in there, but your reagents have a shelf life of 2 years, then there's a risk that there'd be that gap. So you'd have to test your products for the match the minimum of what the actual device itself is claimed of 3 years. Then if other people have experience or have had issues with this, I'd be curious to hear what you have to say.
I don't, but I do have a question that popped into my mind that I think you might know the answer. If, for instance, you're claiming 3 years shelf life and your test results or your reagents have a limitation of 2 years, do you have obviously to go back on that claim and match it to the test results, right?
So your test, you could change if I'm understanding you correctly, you could change the shelf life of your device to 2 years because you have data to support this 2 years based on the shelf life of your reagent, so they could match. It could be the lower of the two. But if your data shows that your reagents are stable at 2 years and your product is labeled for 3 years and they're embedded in the product, it's not something you replace out, then you'd have a problem with
exactly
in there. And it's also an interesting area of stability shelf life testing. It's one of the few areas where you can submit a protocol to continue out your testing and not have to submit the data to FDA. So for example, you claim a 1-year shelf life, you have 1 year real-time data, and you submit a protocol that continues out to test it to 2 years, 3 years, to ultimately increase the shelf life of your product. FDA accepts the 1-year shelf life and they accept the protocol. And as long as your data substantiates first the 2 years or first 18 months and 2 years, then you can keep changing it without going back to FDA. You just document it internally.
Oh, perfect.
So we're going to take 2 more questions before we wrap up today. Here's a good one maybe for everyone. How has the regulatory environment changed over the last 5 to 10 years, and do you see them being more accommodating of new technologies?
I'll give my perspective, then I will be curious to hear my colleagues' perspective because I'm sort of in the weeds on this one. But to answer the bigger question first, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I always say it comes in 5-year cycles. That at one point, FDA is criticized for being too strict and not allowing devices to go to market and having too high a bar and too many requirements. And FDA is a very public-facing organization, so they're hauled before Congress, they're criticized, and they adapt, they change. And then 5 years later, they make things, they become more interactive, they issue more guidance documents telling people what they need in a submission, the submission process gets smoother. And then 5 years later, the patient groups attack FDA, saying you're allowing unsafe or ineffective devices to market. You're being too cozy with industry, and they get hauled before Congress and they get criticized for that. So then they swing the other way. So you see these, like basically 5-year swings in there. And then every 100 years you come along with a pandemic, which just blows everything out of the water. It's like it's not swinging in either direction. It's reacting. It's just a tsunami that they're dealing with. But FDA is an agency that is made up of very dedicated, very hardworking, very intelligent, science data-driven people. And so, they love the technology, and they do want to see improvements in there. But they're also a risk-based agency, and there's the risks to patients, there's the risks to the reputation of the agency, and they're human. There's the risk to their career. So they need to be given the data and the assurance and the information to help them assess the device. And they have made progress. I mean, I think along with those swings, you see over the years that FDA has lessened the regulation on many types of products. They, on a regular basis, turn products that are 510K into 510K exempt. Less frequently, in part because there's less of these devices, they downclassify. PMA devices no longer require PMAs. They go to class 2. That the first or second device of a category may require extensive clinical data. By 3, they may require less clinical data. By 4, they may say, we don't need clinical data. We understand the technology. And then, 5 wants to do a slightly different indication, and they may have some clinical data. So it is an agency that progresses and learns from it. But when there's big changes, it's hard for them to react. And I think one that my colleague Rob mentions all the time is artificial intelligence, machine learning. That is such a different paradigm for FDA, where they're used to coming in with a stable, fixed product. This is what we're clearing. It is this. And they can look at it, they can look at the algorithm, they can look at the data. But something that learns and adapts and become better is not something that fits easily within the regulatory paradigm. And they're struggling with how to adjust it, but they want to, and they will get there. Because I think that's my big message is I'm overall positive that things do improve with the agency, and they want technologies to be out there, even though sometimes it doesn't seem that way to industry.
And I think, Laurie, it's an absolutely fascinating area how FDA and other regulators are going to need to adapt in the future to accommodate digital products, the ones which include artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques. And I think that's a subject for a whole separate webinar. We'll probably do one day and devote discussion to that one topic, because it's going to be key in terms of how regulators keep up with the change in digital technology that's becoming so important within medical community and medical devices.
It's the wave of the future, and it goes in the same way what 10 years ago closed loop technology was, which was initially very scary to FDA. Is the machine, the device basically makes the decision, but they became comfortable in a lot of cases. There's still some, but it's the process needs to adapt to the technology.
Yeah, the point is that regulations, they're always going to be reactive. It's impossible to have preemptive regulations because you don't know what's next. So yeah, it's fascinating. I'm actually looking forward to see what's coming.
And it has to react quicker because the changes happen quicker.
And exponentially.
Not too long ago, I mean, within more than living memory, FDA operated under a 1989 software guidance, and I want to say it was probably 2005 timeframe. They got rid of it. That had been written on a Selectric typewriter, and that was the software policy. So it was, out of date almost as soon as it was issued, and it continued to get more and more up to date over time. Now FDA is almost constantly updating how they approach software.
It's quite interesting to see, for instance, over the last 10 years, software development had a massive change with agile methodologies being brought in. And if you look, even if you look at the 62304, it's a really waterfall process if you take it, a hard look at it. But the FDA was quick to allow the TIR 45 as a guidance for agile methodology for software development in medical devices. So, and at this point, I wouldn't say exactly easier, but it's clearer in the US than it is in other parts of the world when you're developing a software for a medical device or software as a medical device using agile. And there's a parallel there with artificial intelligence, because with agile software development, you build on the features, so you learn through the process, and you reiterate, and you obviously deploy your new firmware, your new software solution. With artificial intelligence, part of this process is automated, and it's done by the machine. So it's as I said before, it's fascinating. I'm sure that the FDA will react and will have a encompassing regulations at one point for artificial intelligence and machine learning.
Excellent. So we have time for one last question. Here's a good one to end on. And I'd love to hear each of your perspectives, kind of like what comes to the top of mind. What do you find most confusing or surprising about the FDA's process? Rob, why don't we start with you?
Oh, I was hoping you'd start with Laurie.
Give away the secret.
That's his confusing part right there.
I'll take up the challenge. What always shocks clients when I try to explain it to them is the iterative process of 510K exemptions. That if you have a classification regulation, it will say this product is 510K exempt, and then it says subject to these limitations. So the technology defined in there is exempt, and then if you trigger the limitations, you require 510K. But if you trigger those limitations and require a 510K and that the product is cleared, that moves the bar for exemption. So the products that have the same characteristics of what triggered the limitation now are exempt. So the exemption expands to encompass that. That needs to be explained over and over and over again to both FDA sometimes when they say, well, no, that's not what's the exemption. It's like, well, that's the process, and sometimes to the client. Another one that I get commonly get questions on is, again, FDA's great strength is not nomenclature. There's class 1 products, class 2 devices, and class 3 devices. Class 1 is the lowest risk, class 2 is the moderate risk, and class 3 is the major risk. This part. On the other hand, recalls is the absolute opposite. Class 1 is the most serious recall and the lowest risk device. Class 2 is moderate across the board, and class 3 is the most minor recalls. So people will say, I have a class 3 device. FDA just told me that. It's like, no, you have a class 3 recall, not a class 3 device. So, in my ideal world, they would have come up with either not call it class or made the numbers consistent. I think the most interesting variable is that when you're dealing with FDA, you're dealing with people, and you have to recognize that. And for the most part, they're very good people, and it's not biased or whatever. But we all have either that one point that needs to be explained to us 20 times, or that we're just not comfortable with it. And a lot of why I'm a big fan of meeting with FDA when you can, and not having a phone call or whatever. And again, technology and times have changed. The technology has gotten better, and right now we can't do the face-to-face meetings. Is that you can look around the room and see that reviewer is just not comfortable. with what we're saying. You know, squirming the teeth and may not be asking. So we need to follow up and address that. And I think most people think of FDA as being kind of a monolith. It's like, this is their position and they have this precedent, and not realizing that we all bring to the table what our comfort levels are or what our concerns are, and they do factor into the process.
I think you make a great point there, Lauren. You are dealing with people, and it does matter how you present the data that you have, and you may end up with a different answer depending on how you package up and present the data that you have on your product. That's why it's important to have the right people helping you with those pre-submission meetings and with your regulatory filings, so that you do it in a way that properly and fully represents your product. And as you say, you're dealing with people who have to interpret the data that you're providing them.
Yeah. And on the same note, now, sorry, Eddie, I'll shut up in a minute and let you talk, is if you have a big PMA that has multi-volumes, there's going to be some little mistake in there, and we all know that. But sloppiness hurts you in there. And so it's often important to have a third party, somebody who hasn't looked at the submission a dozen times, look at it, because if there's inconsistent data or the numbers don't add up, FDA will find it and you can correct it. And, you know, and oftentimes it's just a simple mistake or whatever, but it doesn't leave the right impression with FDA. And they wonder, okay, what else is not, the numbers aren't right that I'm missing. And so it really is worth it. It's not just being the stickler on grammar or something. It's making sure that it presents your case the best way and that there's less risk of FDA having questions that shouldn't be questions.
Yeah. And just to build on the point that you made was actually a brilliant hook for what I was going to say. I think it's about not being arrogant as well. And, you know, the people at FDA, as you said, they are, brilliant people. They are excited about technology. They know their game. So it's about, recognizing that and putting forward a data and information and anything you're putting forward in good faith and being humble as well. One thing I think it's quite surprising, it's not exactly on the FDA itself, is that a lot of companies, they shy away from using the opportunity of a pre-sub. And they sometimes they miss a big opportunity of understanding what's going to be their regulatory pathway, just because they're scared. Just they get petrified once they hear FDA. So I think this is something that a lot of companies could learn. If you have the FDA has this mechanism, and it's there to be used, and make good use of it.
I 100% agree. And the biggest risk is not knowing what FDA thinks. It's not finding out early what FDA thinks, because then you can find it out early enough, you can adjust to almost anything. Not finding out because you're scared of hearing what they say sets you up in a bad position.
100%.
Excellent. So I think that's all the time we have today. Thank you, everyone who joined today. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. And thank you, Laurie, Rob, and Eduardo. Really appreciate all of your insights. Definitely a topic we can talk about in a lot of depth. So I realize there's still questions we didn't have time to respond to. We'll be sure to follow up with those of you who asked questions if you didn't hear a response on the webinar today. Please note, if you'd like to watch this presentation again, it was recorded. We will be sharing this with you via a link afterwards. If you'd like any more information on the topics we discussed, or if you're looking for help with your regulatory strategy, please connect with us through tsgconsulting.com. If you have any product development questions or needs, you may contact us through sygentiainnovation.com. Soon after the webinar, you'll receive a survey, and we'd appreciate if you'd complete it and provide us with your feedback. It helps us to continue to improve and provide you with meaningful content in the future. To stay in touch and learn more about TSG or Sygentia Innovation, please follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter. On behalf of our presenters today, thank you again for joining. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at our next webinar. Thank you.